on wind power in April 2022. And therefore, this meeting is a part of this framework. So this morning will be on trial dedicated to the hydrogen in Africa. And now I'll let Othman start his moderation. Othman.
Yes, thank you, Alison. Maybe a small introduction to our panelists. If you have an introduction to make.
No, they can introduce.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Alison. Just to follow up, dear participants, the webinar will be structured as follow. So Mrs. Rita Madera will explore the potential of African hydrogen hubs with a Pan-African overview, north to south, east to west, in comparison to other countries around the world. Mr. Jean-Christophe Thomas will lean on technical and technological advancements regarding the hydrogen value chain, and Mr. Marcus Courage will look at constraints, particularly costs, infrastructure, fresh water, accessibility, and so on. With no further ado, Rita, the floor is yours. Maybe I'll let you introduce yourself first, and then we go through the other panelists, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Atman. Good morning, everyone. Maybe I'll just start sharing my presentation while I give a quick presentation of myself and the International Energy Agency. So my name is Rita Madeira. I'm Africa Program Officer at the IEA. The International Energy Agency, for those who might not be aware, is an international intergovernmental organization that is one of the leading institutions when it comes to energy data, energy analysis. As a matter of fact, we're just about to launch the World Energy Outlook in half an hour, which is obviously a flagship report. And my role, I coordinate, oversee, and develop the bilateral and regional analytical work on sub-Saharan Africa. But today we're here to talk about hydrogen, so I thought it would be interesting to present some key highlights on our most recent analysis on the topic. And for those who might want to dig deeper, I'll be mostly discussing key findings of the Africa Energy Outlook that we released earlier this year, and basically focuses on the continent, as Othman said, and looks at the current geopolitical context, obviously the energy crisis, and sets out pathways for Africa as a whole, as a continent, to achieve its development goals, notably universal access, but also access to energy, but also climate goals. Then I'll also talk a little bit about the Global Hydrogen Review that we launched just a month ago, and is really our flagship report on hydrogen, and it basically tracks hydrogen production and demand worldwide, as well as progress in critical areas such as infrastructure, development, trade, policy, regulation, investment, and innovation, and all topics that I'll be touching on in my presentation. So in terms of analysis, and I like to start by showing this map because it shows the potential of some African regions and countries for hydrogen production at a low cost. So one of the key findings of our analysis is that the production of low emissions hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels such as ammonia using Africa's ample renewable energy resources offers a very interesting economic opportunity for some regions and some countries. So obviously it's a huge continent and it has one of the largest potentials in the world for producing hydrogen from low-cost renewable electricity, and largely from solar, PV, and wind, which obviously combined offer the best fuel load hours for hydrogen production, and is linked to the low cost as well. In terms of production potential, the region has the potential to produce up to 5,000 megatons per year at a cost below to United States dollars. Obviously, this is not for every country in Africa, and this is something that we'll talk about later. But for those who have those renewable energy resources and potential, this is a very good economic opportunity. Obviously, there are ongoing projects that the audience might be aware of, and it's very good to see that those projects match the data that we found. So we have there are projects ongoing in Mauritania, Namibia, Egypt, South Africa, and if you look at the map, you'll see that the regions in the darkest blue and the immediate, the second darkest blue are the regions that we're talking about, and where you can see those projects. Also, the Horn of Africa also has a huge potential in terms of hydrogen production. I will talk, and I don't know, Othman, how much time do I have to make like this set the scene presentation, but I have one or two more slides, but feel free to interrupt me and happy to come back to it later if you'd like to hear from other speakers in the meantime. But just to make a point on local demand and domestic use of hydrogen, because there's all this potential, but we know that it's not all roses, right? So, and something that we'll also talk about, I think, during our session today is that all of these big projects are predicated on offtake, for an offtake or export, right? But all of these projects also need to look and to cater for domestic demand. And one of the things that we found is that domestic demand in some of these countries might be actually difficult to stimulate without government policies, support from the international community, including financial support. And so, especially for countries that currently do not produce hydrogen, so with the South Africa already produces hydrogen, as we know, but some other countries with big projects do not yet produce. And maybe I'll just make a quick link here to the global picture where we see that overall hydrogen production worldwide is mostly currently results from unabated fossil fuels, and only around 1 megaton worldwide currently results from low emissions sources. So it's still the big picture that we have today. So stimulating that demand might be difficult, especially in the short term, and our analysis shows that actually in the short term it is not competitive when you compare it to natural gas. Even in a scenario with high natural gas prices, and even for countries that currently import natural gas like South Africa. So this is a little bit the picture in terms of short term versus longer term when it comes to domestic demand. I will just quickly move to the export side of things to put a little bit the continent on the broader picture, and then I'll save the rest for our discussion later. But when we look, and this is also a figure from our global hydrogen review, and this is based on existing project pipelines. And if we look at export planned exports by 2030 in Africa, we see that it's mostly Mauritania, obviously Namibia, Morocco, South Africa, so all the places that I've mentioned that have ongoing projects. But we see that there's competitors. For example, Latin America is poised to become a very big exporter of hydrogen. And then obviously, I mean, in terms of geographical location, it might not be an immediate competitor to Africa, especially if we're thinking about exports to Europe. But then if you look at the Middle East, and even countries in Europe, then there's a very big competitor. And obviously, African countries would be running against, I mean, in the sense that would be in competition with these jurisdictions, which in terms of geography might be closer to the destination of the export. So just to put in perspective that once we talk about international trade, and there's a lot of additional considerations we can make about international trade of hydrogen right now, but it's a different picture. So I think I can stop here, Othman, so we can hear about we can hear from other panelists, and then happy to answer any questions that anyone may have. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Madera. That was fantastic. presentation. Jean-Christophe?
Yes.
Sorry, let me just stop sharing my screen. I don't see where we are. Sorry, not used to WebEx. Can you still share my screen? Can maybe the host stop me sharing the screen? I'm having trouble finding. Stop sharing. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much.
And now you should be able to see my screen, correct?
Yes, yes.
When the laser light?
Yes,
Okay.
indeed. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks a lot, Rita, for this interesting presentation. I will just briefly introduce myself. I'm Jean-Christophe Thomas. I'm French, based in Abidjan, Ivory Coast in West Africa, and I'm the managing director for Siemens Energy for Western and Central Africa, the French-speaking countries. Very briefly, what Siemens Energy is doing. So we are an independent company since September 2020. And basically we got all the activities that were formerly within Siemens for the energy sector, and it was decided to be independent, to be a bit more agile, and we're working in generation of electricity, could be conventional or renewables with our subsidiary Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy, transmission, the transport and the transmission of electricity, high voltage equipment, high voltage substations, grid stability. And we got as well industrial applications with compressors, rotating equipment, and steam turbines, for example. Okay, next slide. So Siemens Energy is a German company, so I'd like to have an agenda, but I have a bit more slides than Rita, but I'll try to speed it up, not to be too long and to give space for questions. So first, just to discuss about Africa, the potential and the opportunities. Then we'll speak about the green hydrogen value chain. We'll have a look at the technologies in this value chain, and last, a couple of ongoing projects that we have at the moment, and that might be interesting use cases for Africa. So briefly on the first one, so I think Rita already said it. Africa has a very good potential in terms of wind resource and solar resource. So of course the combination of both is the most interesting for the electrolyzers and the production of green hydrogen, because you could have a better capacity factor of your electrolyzers, having a combination of solar and wind, which means probably the first movers in terms of the countries which will get the first green hydrogen projects will be probably these ones having the good combination of wind and solar. But that doesn't mean that for the other countries, there won't be green hydrogen projects, but that may be the second or the third movers. And it might not be a bad point to be a second or a third mover, because if you wait a bit more, then you could benefit from the technological improvements and get probably lower prices in terms of production. That's something we've seen, for example, for the wind power market. The first countries who installed wind turbines had higher prices, and now we see the latest countries, and especially for offshore wind, for example, they have these technology improvements with twice bigger turbines and then a lower price of electricity. So now that's the dilemma for Africa. Green hydrogen, will that be for export or for the internal or the regional market? We see two things on this map, basically. That's the potential for green hydrogen on the different continents, but as well the energy-related emissions in 2019 for the different countries. So we see that the biggest, let's say, polluters or the countries who have the highest or the biggest emissions, that's basically in Asia. So we see like China, the US, and a couple of countries in Europe. Then will these countries be autonomous in the production of their own green hydrogen? We can see with China, for example, they got a couple of renewable potential. The same in the US, but we see a lot less in Europe, in fact. So which means that there's a huge potential to export to these countries, and with the position of Africa, mainly to export to Europe. Second thing we see that sub-Saharan Africa has really very low emission, which means it's linked as well to the level of industrialization of the continent. But some will say that not being industrialized is something bad, but we see it as an opportunity to create a brand new green industry, and we are thinking mainly about transforming the raw materials that Africa has at the moment to end products with a very high value and with a full green industry chain. We'll talk about example later on, I think, in the discussion. So very briefly, so Siemens Energy, we got a long presence in Africa. So we've been in Africa since in South Africa since 1895. Through Siemens Gamesa, we are doing wind projects for 20 years, and we got, for example, wind turbines for more than 3.4 gigawatts. And basically, our model is to do the projects and then to be there to support the entire life cycle of the projects we are selling and we're installing. So now the green hydrogen value chain. So we're talking first about sector coupling and basically the different use cases of green hydrogen. That first we need to speak about really the energy production, and really the first thing to think about is how do we really step out of fossil fuels, and the first step is really decarbonize the electricity production. So which means all the fossil fuel power plants need to be converted into wind, solar, or hydro, because it doesn't make sense to use electricity from a coal-fired power plant to produce hydrogen. At the end, the emissions won't be lower. So first, we need to basically to make green to have renewable energy to produce electricity. Then we need to see which kind of sectors we can electrify and which sectors we cannot electrify. So there are a couple of sectors that we could electrify. I don't know if the screen is big enough or it's okay. So on the mobility, for example, we can think about the trains. So there might not be a need for hydrogen in the train because it could be electrified. But there will be some other sectors like petrochemical industry or steel industry, cement, or chemical industry that cannot be fully electrolyzed. They need anyways some gas, and we need to see how we can produce this gas from renewable energy, green hydrogen, and then the end product. How to produce hydrogen and which technologies are involved. So we see first, as I said, let's say we need to produce renewables out of wind, solar, or hydro. There will be, of course, some transmission or some technologies coming from transmission, like transformer, high voltage lines, and equipments. The electrolyzers to transform the water into green hydrogen. There will be some compression, basically to compress and transport this hydrogen. We see all these industrial applications for e-ammonia or e-fuels that can be used in mobility or in various industries. And something that very often we don't mention, but we are talking very often about power to X, but there is as well this power to X to power, where we see that hydrogen play a role in purely being not an end product, but used for storage of energy, basically. So we can have H2 storage and use this green hydrogen back into gas turbines to reproduce electricity. And that would help, for example, to stabilize the network, especially when we have wind, and solar on the network that are variable energy sources. So what is Siemens Energy doing in this value chain? So we basically cover the full value chain from renewable power, transmission, and hydrogen. We got the capabilities internally to do basic engineering, proprietary technology for hydrogen. We can do full turnkey for hydrogen plants and transmission substations, and basic engineering or full turnkey for Power-to-X in collaboration with partners. Something that is very important to mention is that these projects are so big that no one can do it alone, and we'll see later on that the partnerships are very important on the full value chain, from the renewable energy production to really the end off-taker of the final product. So I'd like to talk a bit about the technology now, and especially the electrolyzers, but as well a bit about the gas turbines. So there are basically at the moment three main technologies for water electrolysis. The first one is the alkaline electrolysis. The second one, that's the PEM electrolysis, and the last one is the high temperature. So according to the Fraunhofer Institute, there are two technologies that are industrially mature. That's the alkaline and the PEM electrolysis. The one that Siemens Energy is supplying at the moment, that's basically the PEM electrolysis. And the reason why we went for that technology, that's basically to be aligned with our scope of supply, because the PEM electrolysis is much more reactive in terms of power changes. So which means when you combine it with the wind power and the loads can change, these PEM electrolyzers can react much more faster than the alkaline electrolyzer. Just to give you an overview of what we've been doing in terms of electrolyzers. So we've been producing our first electrolyzer in 2011, so more than 10 years now. And since then, we see that so the size of the electrolyzers is multiplied by 10 every 4 to 5 years. So it's really ramping up very fast, in fact. So we are talking about 0.1 megawatts in 2011. In 2018, Siemens Energy manufactured the biggest PEM cell in the world, and now the size of the Silyzer 300 is around 17 to 18 megawatts. Just a few facts on the Silyzer 300. It can produce in 1 hour 335 kilograms of hydrogen at an efficiency of more than 75%. As I said, 17 megawatts in terms of power. And very important, that's these two ones, the startup time and the dynamics. The startup time is less than 1 minute, in fact, so it could go full capacity in 1 minute. And the dynamics is basically it can absorb variation of loads of 10% in only 1 second. And I think that's very important, and especially for Africa, because we see in Europe, for example, when we want to produce green hydrogen, we're talking about how the grid can support the production of green hydrogen. But I think that in Africa, it will be totally the opposite. Because if you consider the installed capacity in Northern and Western Africa, around 11 gigawatts for Morocco, 1.5 for Senegal, and we're talking about projects in Mauritania of 10 gigawatts and 30 gigawatts, which means like at least one time up to 3 times the size of the grid of the neighboring countries. So which means that these green hydrogen projects will probably or might help to support the grid instead of the grid to support the production of green hydrogen in these countries. Okay, so this is just a picture of how it looks like. In fact, I think that's important because most of, or let's say that there are lots of companies which say that they manufacture electrolyzers, but very often we see drawings, but we don't see concrete parts and products. So this one is installed since 4 years now and running. I will show the application later on. So in terms of capabilities of supply chain, I think that there is a stress already on the supply chain because of all of these giga scale projects are coming, and the developers are already trying to get some slots on the production chain for 2024, 2025. So we anticipated that one. And Siemens Energy is now in a joint venture together with Air Liquide, the French company. So 75% Siemens Energy, 25% for Air Liquide. And we are doing together in this joint venture the research and development on the electrolyzers and the gigafactory. So we aim to be able to produce 1 gigawatt of electrolyzers per year in 2023 in Berlin. And we already got locked options to produce plus 1 gigawatt per year up to 2025, which means 3 gigawatts per year in 2025. Now, just a short slide on the capabilities of our gas turbines. As I said, so we are talking now about power to X2 power, so produce hydrogen out of renewable electricity and then use this hydrogen in gas turbines. Most of our medium-sized gas turbines, they are able to run with 75% hydrogen instead of natural gas or propane. We aim to have all our turbines being able to run 100% with hydrogen by 2030. But I would say right now, the issue is not really the technology and the research of development. The issue is the quantity of hydrogen that is available to run 100%, to run the gas turbine 100% with hydrogen. So we got, for example, the SGT A35, so around 30 megawatts, that could run 100% with a white low emission burner. And we got an example of one SGT 400 that could run already 100%. That's a pilot project that I will explain later on. Ongoing projects and how they can be used in Africa. So this project is the one I showed the picture of the electrolyzer previously. And so that's a small one, 6 megawatt. That's a pilot project that is running since 2019 already. And it's basically the supply of green hydrogen for a steel making process. So it's basically to produce steel. The hydrogen is used in the steel factory. And that's typically one example of decarbonation of the steel making process. And I'd like to mention here the project that we are seeing now coming in Mauritania. One of the use cases is basically to use this green hydrogen produced out of renewables, wind and solar, to use it for the steel making process, which means that the iron ore that they have in Mauritania, they aim to transform it in country and then export a green steel instead of exporting the raw material, the iron ore. And I think that's really a huge potential for Africa to be able to create these value chains and with a green industry, and that could be really a competitive advantage compared to I don't know, any steel industry produced out of coal-fired power plants in China, for example. So I think that's really a huge opportunity for Africa. A second case that's in France, and that's a project funded by the European Union. That's what we call high-flex power, and that's a typical example of power to X2 power. So green hydrogen is produced out of hydroelectricity and renewable from the grid through an electrolyzer. It's compressed, it's stored, and then we use it. It could be in combination with natural gas or 100% hydrogen on a small gas turbine, 12 megawatts, so SGT 400. The news on that one is that the gas turbine has done its first fire 4 weeks ago now, 100% with hydrogen. So hydrogen, 100%, running a gas turbine with 100% hydrogen is already possible. And that's basically one concrete example. It's running right now. But as I said, now the main point is really the availability of hydrogen to be burned in gas turbines. As an example, worldwide, Siemens Energy has more than 50 units running on green fuels or a combination of green fuel with gas. So maybe the other one, and that's a use case for mobility. That's a project that is under construction at the moment in Chile to produce basically e-fuel and methanol for ships. So e-fuel that will be for cars, and the methanol for the ships basically. On that one, Chile is really a nice location because again a good combination of wind and solar. Sorry, just to mention on that one. So we've seen, for example, for Africa, this kind of projects being developed by Scatec, for example, in Egypt. And again, Egypt is the perfect location. It's close to the Canal of Suez. There are lots of boats coming in, and then that's basically the perfect location to have such projects to produce fuel for ships. In fact, so again, that's a nice opportunity for Africa. And the last one, sorry, I was a bit long. The last one, so this is a hybrid project that is currently under construction in French Guyana, so in South America, and that's a hybrid project combining solar panels with battery storage and an electrolyzer, green hydrogen storage, and a fuel cell. Basically, how it works, so the solar panels are producing electricity for consumption during the day. The overcapacity is used and stored in the battery and is used to produce hydrogen through the electrolyzer, and then the hydrogen is stored. At the end of the day, when the sun is decreasing, then that's the battery storage are taking the lead, and then are basically providing the energy for the peak consumption that we usually see at the end of the day. And then overnight, when there's less consumption, that's the green hydrogen that is taking the lead and that is producing electricity through a fuel cell. So to give you an idea of the size, we're talking about 55 megawatt of solar panels. We're talking about 10 megawatt, 40 megawatt hour for the batteries. So batteries, they could produce 10 megawatt for 4 hours. And the H2 storage with the fuel cell can produce 3 megawatts for the rest of the night. And we think that's typically this example for Africa that could be used for off-grid, so either off-grid cities or the mining sector. That could be something really interesting for the mines, which are quite big consumers and are usually off-grid. And that was the last example on my side. So, but I'll stay open for questions.
Excellent, Jean-Christophe. Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. Maybe Marcus, if you want to take the lead.
Thanks, Atman. I have a much shorter presentation, but thank you very much to you for this opportunity to speak and to share some of my experience, which is much shorter than the other two speakers who've addressed us. But for the last 18 months, I've been very piqued by the opportunity that Africa has to play not just a role, but I'm hoping a lead role in the hydrogen economy. And I hope that in some of the slides I present now, we'll see why. My name is Marcus Courage, and I, well, let me just try and get my screen. I'm the CEO of a advisory group called Africa Practice. We're a Pan-African consultancy with colleagues located in offices in East, West, Central, Southern Africa, and a team in London also. For 20 years now, we were founded in 2003. We've been working with leaders in both the public and private sectors to create markets that serve underserved communities in Africa and to create enabling environments for private participation in those markets so that those markets can grow and thrive and generate inclusive growth. We operate very much at the intersection of markets and the state, supporting leaders of both the public sector and private sector to co-create policies and regulations that achieve effective enabling environments for industry and economies to grow. We're heavily invested in the energy transition, not just through the portfolio of clients that we serve, advise, and represent, but also through the role that we play at the African Hydrogen Partnership. So my colleague Richard Kiplagat, who's based in Nairobi, is the chair of the Advocacy Task Force for the AHP. The AHP was founded just over 18 months ago as a trade association representing industry and working with industry to share knowledge and best practice and to develop green and natural hydrogen projects on the African continent. They engage regularly with African governments, and most recently they led a delegation to Somalia and to Tanzania to look at the opportunities for hydrogen projects in those two markets. The appeal of green hydrogen, when it was first introduced to me, as I say, 18 months ago, was very apparent. The promise of zero emissions energy supply, even when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. That's why this fuel, but also energy vector, is so attractive and so appealing. But fundamentally, its appeal is in being a catalyst for green industrialization on the continent. And that's what Jean-Christophe referred to in his presentation. And that's where I see and my colleagues see the real opportunity for Africa to be the first region in the world to achieve clean industrialization. And if we doubted the imperative, we only need to look at the unemployment statistics all across the continent to recognize just how important creating manufacturing jobs is for mopping up the millions of graduates who graduate each year without the prospect of good jobs and employment. Let me take us on to the next slide. I hope you can see that. As our moderator said at the outset, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the barriers, the constraints. And actually, over the last 18 months, many of these constraints have been reducing. So let's start with the production cost. As Rita told us earlier, green hydrogen can now be produced at $2 a kilogram. $2 a kilogram. That's significantly less than it just was even 6 or 12 months ago. And that's encouraging. And some countries on the continent, I'm told, may be capable of producing green hydrogen for even 50% of that price. Such is the quality of our renewable energy sources on the continent that it should be possible to produce electricity at a much cheaper price than some other regions of the world. Then when you consider our available land mass and the opportunities to put wind turbines and and solar panels up. And then you consider that we have many of the, in Africa, there are many fewer regulatory restrictions in terms of planning and environmental considerations than there are, for example, in urban Europe. That's the opportunity and the potential for us to develop both hydrogen projects and a hydrogen economy. But I do think, as Rita said, that for some areas in the value chain, it's going to be really important to look at subsidies and incentives for industry. So in the US, recently, the US Inflation Reduction Act was introduced, which makes production of green hydrogen very competitive there. And our policymakers and regulators on the continent are going to need to look at similar incentives, but including possibly tax credits, which is well used in both the US and the EU, and other forms of subsidy to really lift the industry and kickstart the growth of the hydrogen economy on the continent. Dedicated infrastructure. So there's very little dedicated hydrogen infrastructure in the world, let alone in Africa. But the good news is that lots of our existing natural gas infrastructure with relatively few modifications can be repurposed for hydrogen transportation. The other thing to bear in mind is that along the value chain, the energy content within the electrolysis and then the other forms of transformation that occur, the energy content, the energy loses value. So as the text there shows to you, in the first conversion of hydrogen to other carriers, it can lose between 13 and 25%. So whilst that is something that is inherently not good in terms of efficiency, the truth is that what it lends itself to, as Jean-Christophe was referring to in the case of Mauritania, is the appeal for global manufacturing businesses to locate themselves close to the source of the hydrogen production. And that single issue means that least developing countries and African hydrogen producing countries specifically will, we hope, be in a position where they're capable of attracting global manufacturing to locate close to the source of hydrogen production in Africa. And that, of course, is incredibly attractive. And then when you consider initiatives like the EU Green Deal, which imposes a carbon tax on goods and services that have a fossil fuel contribution to their manufacture or their delivery, then the appeal of locating in a low carbon jurisdiction or a zero carbon jurisdiction is incredibly attractive. And that's what we hope will be the great opportunity for Africa to attract foreign direct investment and local investment and to build a manufacturing base using hydrogen, not just as a source of fuel, but also as an energy vector and all of its derivatives to create hydrogen economies. That's the philosophy that's being adopted in many regions of the world with the creation of hydrogen corridors. And for those of you who haven't seen the South African Society Roadmap, Hydrogen Society Roadmap, I would encourage you to look at it. It's a really, really great document that sets out the concept for a hydrogen corridor that would run from Mpumalanga, I think it is, down to KwaZulu-Natal. The forecasts that are placed in there are that they could create, that corridor has the potential to create 3 million jobs by 2050. The employment potential is staggering. I know because I was looking only yesterday at the CPW framework agreement signed with the government in Mauritius. And there they think by 2035 that they contribute, I think it's a third, no, I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but it's a very significant proportion of job creation and about a quantum of 40 to 50% of national GDP. So the scale and contribution of these projects, both to economic growth but to job creation, are really profound. And then when you combine that with the the fact that it will mean that countries like Tanzania, for example, which spends almost 20% of, I think it's more than 20%, it's around about 25% of its GDP on importing refined fossil fuels. If you can substitute some of that with green hydrogen, you can see that there's also a very net positive effect on balance of payments for hydrogen producing countries on the continent. Water scarcity. So the electrolysis process relies on clean water supply. And we know that many regions and countries of the continent are water scarce, particularly in North Africa. And so that's a consideration that will need to be reflected in adjudicating how to design and manage hydrogen projects. And finally, I think the importance around accreditation. The real appeal of both natural and green hydrogen is, of course, its zero carbon content, and it's that will command a premium in the markets. And it's important that the procedures exist to be able to validate the carbon neutrality of that fuel or that source. So there's a lot of work involved in doing that, and the verification agencies will be salivating at the prospect of all the work that will be coming downstream for them. I did want to touch briefly on a point that Siggy Hugerman, who's the co-initiator of the African Hydrogen Partnership, has been at pains to point out to me. He said we shouldn't get too carried away with the big opportunities, some of those that I reflected in the South African Hydrogen Society Roadmap Ambition, and you're going to see CPW project ambition in Mauritius, but focus in the first instance on domestic markets and the decarbonisation of, in particular, incumbent agricultural sector. So a derivative of hydrogen electrolysis is ammonia, which of course is a key ingredient for fertilizer production. So the opportunity to produce green fertilizer and to support agricultural contribution and productivity on the continent. We know that fertilizer input proportionate to other regions of the world is much smaller, and that our productivity, our agricultural yield is poor by comparison with other regions of the world. By being capable of producing our own fertilizer, our own green fertilizer, we're in a position of really contributing to what we hope might be an agrarian revolution on the continent, and ensuring that there's food security in many countries. And then to focus on the hard-to-abate sectors in the way that Jean-Christophe referenced. So steel was the case in point that he mentioned. It's cheaper to produce green steel at the point of hydrogen production, so close to the source of green hydrogen, than it is to ship green ammonia or green molecules to a steel processing plant in Europe. So the incentive to locate that manufacturing process, at the point of production is very attractive, and that of course is this huge appeal for Africa of this particular energy vector in the field. And finally, a point that I wanted to touch on, not strictly relevant to the hydrogen value chain directly, but of course relevant in the context of what we're discussing. So the world is at this tipping point where we know we're contending with a global climate crisis, and our leaders will be meeting in the next week or so in Sharm el-Sheikh to as part of the COP27 deliberations. The imperative to decarbonize is clear to all of us, and Africa has a very significant, if not a lead role in helping the world to decarbonize. We have abundant renewable, and there I've listed many of the countries who have really strong renewable potential. One of the areas that hasn't been mentioned to date, but I think is worth mentioning, is geothermal. So many of you would know that I think it's 90% of Kenya's energy is renewable at the moment, and an increasing contribution to the grid is coming from geothermal. So Kenya has really strong geothermal potential. The value of geothermal is that it's consistent, so it's a good source of base load power. Solar, hydro, wind, and then green hydrogen. We've broadly referenced, and we've seen a few maps, but the 6 members of the African Green Hydrogen Alliance are Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, Kenya, Namibia, and Mauritania, which have really strong wind and solar, as we know. I mean, in the case of South Africa and Egypt, good infrastructure, but also in the case of Kenya too, which, as I mentioned, has a very good transmission grid and other logistics that's required for the industry. And the one point that I did want to reference, because it has a direct bearing on the appeal for Africa in developing the capacity to manufacture electrolyzers, and that is that the greatest proportion of platinum group metals in the world exists in Southern Africa. I think it's upwards of more than 80% of the world's PGM deposits are in the region, and platinum, of course, is a key component in the electrolysis process in electrolyzers. But all those critical minerals and rare earths, some of which I list there, are critical to the energy transition, to the global energy transition. And Africa's position as a source of these minerals, metals, and rare earths, and as a continent that has, in many countries' cases, comparative advantage in terms of its renewable energy potential, really makes Africa, to my mind, a natural resources superpower. And here I'm even discounting Africa's natural capital, its forests and savannas, mangroves, which sequester a lot of the world's carbon emissions. So my hope very much is that we can realize a tipping point over the course of the next months and years, in which we don't just view the African continent as the continent that's most vulnerable to climate change, and that's contributed least to global carbon emissions, but we see Africa as a leader in the world's attempts to decarbonize the planet. And in that respect, Africa should have a leading seat at the table in discussions around climate change issues and the energy transition. So I'll stop there if I may.
Excellent, Marcus. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. Maybe we still, I think, on schedule, and we have probably 35 to 30 minutes of discussion. And I want to have some, I would say, provocative thoughts and addressing the elephants in the room about hydrogen, the scaled up hydrogen economy. First thing that maybe I should start with, and of course we're open also for other questions from the participants. So renewable energy, I think, is not always cheap for African countries. And I think also green hydrogen from green electricity sources won't be that cheap for African nations, because they face, as you know, energy access and capacity short system constraints. Technology is not there yet to have a scaled up green hydrogen economy, which means a cost-effective green hydrogen molecule. Capital costs are still very high, and transportation in particular is a huge burden, I think, to move hydrogen around. Of course, there is also this idea of liquefying it as we do with natural gas, but liquefying it needs, I think, minus 260 plus degrees Celsius, which makes it very hard to control the temperatures. It leaks easily. It is less dense. Require, as Thomas said, there is storage, but it requires more storage because of its density, and is also very expensive to handle at the moment. So how do you think this will be an opportunity for Africa? Which means, should we not focus more about the short midterm, and as Marcus also emphasized on, the domestic industries first, rather than thinking about Africa being this hydrogen powerhouse production region that could maybe eventually produce hydrogen, but there is no off-takers of this expensive hydrogen that they want to sell. So I think, how do you think, and this is a question for the three of you, our panelists, how do you think it is an opportunity for Africa?
Who wants to start? I think Marcus, maybe it was more linked to your presentation.
Well, I think, as you know, because it's what I presented, I think the African nations should look at the domestic market opportunity and the off-takers within the domestic market. And there are some clear and obvious ones within the value chain there. So fertilizer and other uses for ammonia, including in the mining industry. It's used for explosives. We've got a big mining industry on the continent, and we'll have a growing mining industry because we know that many of the minerals and metals are required for the energy transition globally. So some of the figures that you see are that an electric vehicle has 8 times more copper than a combustion engine vehicle, and so on and so forth. And so the expectation is there that more mining projects are going to come on stream, and more demand for explosives in that area. But just looking at the value chain opportunities in the domestic and regional markets, I think there's an imperative for African countries to collaborate and to create regional value chains also. So I was so glad to see the initiative to establish the African Green Hydrogen Alliance, where public sector leaders from those 6 countries are exchanging on a fairly regular basis. So, and I think, I mean, I hear your question, but I would take, I'm also very, very aware that Germany has taken a keen interest in the development of Namibia's hydrogen projects, and that can't be for completely selfless ends. It is because Europe cannot decarbonize without African green hydrogen. Europe doesn't have the potential to produce green hydrogen at the cost that we can on the African continent, and so I remain to be challenged, but the statement is there. Europe cannot decarbonize without our green hydrogen, and so I think that in the longer term, that's an opportunity too. But as I say, the imperative must be to focus on domestic off-takers in the first instance.
Maybe I can chip in as well, and because I think there's a lot to unpack in that question. So you mentioned one aspect that you mentioned that is very important is in terms of cost, right? But I think we could look at it a little bit just separately because, well, as we know, cost of capital in African countries remains quite high, and that's for projects across the board. So not just for green hydrogen projects. Or in fact, we've looked at it and found out that it can be as high as 7 times higher than cost of capital in Europe and in the United States or the other jurisdictions. So that is a problem for all clean energy investment, right? So it's not just for hydrogen. Now, another thing that I would look at separately as well is the access to energy bit that you mentioned. And maybe I'll just quickly mention that one of the key findings of the Africa Energy Outlook that we launched is that in the main scenario that we modelize in that piece of analysis, Africa the African continent as a whole, and this is how scenarios work, right? So it's the broad picture and not individual countries. But for the continent to reach universal access by 2030, there needs to be massive investment and mostly in renewable energy. So wind, solar, and all those renewable sources will be key to drive the electrification process in African countries. So that brings the point that you mentioned that I think is relevant, is this in competition to using those sources to produce hydrogen? And I don't know if there's a clean cut answer to this, because you can argue both ways, right? So maybe I'm not I'm not necessarily going to address that, but I think that if you and Marcus touched on this in a very interesting way in his presentation when he was talking about the domestic market for hydrogen and beyond. And I think maybe I'll link it to natural gas as well, because especially in the short term, and that is another key finding in our analysis, is that in the short term, gas presents a very good opportunity for industrialization for some African countries. So if you look at it in the short term, there are incentives for the short term to invest in gas, for to produce feedstocks as well, obviously to feed into. I mean, many countries have gas to power strategies, so to feed into heavy energy intensive industries. But then, as the world decarbonizes, obviously this is less of an opportunity in the long term. So there are risks associated with gas projects in the medium to long term, and that's where hydrogen could really play a role, even in Africa, within Africa. Jean-Christophe mentioned this in those hard to abate sectors such as steel. Obviously, there's a huge role to be played on production of feedstocks for fertilizers, for example. So the green ammonia was mentioned, and that will be critical for enhancing food security, even for each country, but on the region as well. So I think maybe just some insights to try and answer your question, which is difficult to answer. Thanks.
Okay. Maybe Othman, if I just want to comment.
Yeah, of course.
The last comment from Rita was really interesting. You know, it's about the investment in natural gas, in fact. There have been like ongoing discussions, we know, with different countries in West Africa, like Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, because they have huge gas resources, but they struggle a bit to find the financing to develop it. Now, we think it's very important to consider gas in the energy transition because it could be developed a bit faster than green hydrogen, at least in very large quantities. And these countries, they are really they're fighting for their right to develop their natural gas industry. On our side, we think gas, of course, is a fossil fuel, but it could be used within the energy transition. And it's better if gas is used for the development of the domestic market, in fact. So we see more benefits if gas is used in gas to power, so like basically gas-fired or combined cycle power plants, to give access to electricity to the people in these countries who have usually a very low access to electricity rate. Now, these are usually huge investments. And some of the investors, they might consider that if they invest in gas now, then their asset in 5 to 10 years will be lost. But that's not the case. And that's very important because as I explained, our gas turbines are able to be converted to hydrogen. And at the moment, Siemens Energy received from TÜV, so the German certification body, the first certificate for a hydrogen-ready power plant. So which means that the power plants that we design and we manufacture, even if the hydrogen is not available right now in very big quantities, they are already hydrogen-ready, which means once the hydrogen is available, they can be just transformed and then to switch the gas from the fuel from natural gas to hydrogen. And that's a way to secure the investment. And that's something we see now from project developers that are already asking these kind of questions to make sure that they can turn in 15 or 20 years their power plant from gas to hydrogen. Now coming back to the main question regarding like domestic market or export market. Again, for us, like in Africa, we think it's better to have use cases for the domestic market. And if we consider as well, as Marcus said, the difficulties to transport the green hydrogen, or as well the need for infrastructure like hydrogen pipelines to export from Africa to Europe, it will take time to build this infrastructure and to get the transport costs at an acceptable price. So we think the first project, and again Marcus presented it, might be the ones with a use case for the domestic market, like green steel production. It could be as well the production of aluminium in Guinea, for example, and these are huge resources. Now, when we see other products like green ammonia, for example, it could be for the export market, and it's already possible to export and to transport easily green ammonia. But you need to consider that this export market, there will be a global competition. So which means like African countries will be in competition with Chile, for example. And we see that right now, at least the pilot project we are doing together with Porsche as an off-taker is all in Chile, because it's where we could get the lowest cost for the production of e-methanol or green fuels. And that's where, you know, not all the countries in Africa will be able to compete really in this export market. So maybe like Mauritania or Morocco or Namibia could compete, but I think the other ones they should maybe more consider really the domestic market. And then when you consider the domestic market, it's you're not in competition with like internationally, but you compare different things. If we take, for example, the mining sector, will you switch from fossil fuels to a green hydrogen to produce electricity for a mine which is off-grid? Then you will compare the cost of the fuel and the security of supply for the fuel that you use at the moment versus the production of green hydrogen, and then there could be a business case.
Fantastic, thank you. I think I will come back to the domestic and export side of hydrogen, maybe particularly green hydrogen. There is a question from the participants from Quentin. So he says that hydrogen is reliant on scattered resource, namely water and land, which poses challenges for large-scale units. Does it mean that hydrogen prompts the end of industrial economies of scale? Does it mean that hydrogen manufacturing of goods powered by hydrogen will remain based on small units to be cost efficient? So the first question is, hydrogen is reliant on scattered resource, namely water and land, which poses challenges for large-scale unit. Does it mean that H2 prompts the end of industrial economies of scale? So that's the first question. Any thoughts? Maybe I will put it on the chat.
I got some thoughts, but I don't know if Rita want to answer or.
Sorry, I'm struggling to understand the question. So if you have thoughts, go ahead while I read it a bit more carefully.
So
Jean-Christophe, maybe?
Yeah, maybe just a comment. I don't think that, yeah, of course, and I think Marcus said it, there is water scarcity. There is a lack of energy in some countries of Africa. I disagree a bit with the land because there are huge lands not used, especially in the desert of Sahara, with good wind and solar. So I don't think there's a scarcity really on the land, in fact, or at least not on one land that you could use for agriculture at least. Now regarding the scarcity for water, and we could put electricity in it as well. I think that's the opposite. That this green hydrogen project that they will help to get water, because if you got a big water desalination unit to get water for the electrolysis, then of course you can maybe add 5 or 10%, and then provide the water to like some people in the nearby villages, or for agriculture as well. In fact, so you will build infrastructure that will have an impact to reduce water scarcity. And that's the same for electricity. In fact, you will build for the green hydrogen plants a lot of wind farms and solar farms. And you could just build up a bit or increase a bit the capacity, and to get more electricity that you could provide to electrify basically all the people nearby. So I think that's more the opposite. And then, but we're talking more about large scale than small scale projects.
Rita, any thoughts, Marcus?
No, I think I would tend to agree with Jean-Christophe, and I think that it's a bit broad to seal the death of industrial economies of scale just based on one premise. And again, I think we cannot look at it on a blanket, right? Because it will depend on the specific country. It will depend on the specific. I mean, there are different projects, right? For example, in Namibia, there's a massive project where you would need the investment that is more than the GDP of the country. But you also have smaller projects, right? That focus on, for example, there's one project that is focused on producing hydrogen then to feed back into the electric grid. So it really depends on the specifics of the project, and I don't think we can just make a blanket assessment on that front. But the rest I would tend to agree with Jean-Christophe.
Fantastic. I do have also a question, because we focused more about green hydrogen, and green hydrogen would eventually need green electricity sources. You don't want to flow it through the grid, because when you flow it through the grid, you can't monitor electricity. So shouldn't the focus be more on grid-based, low-carbon hydrogen production through electrolysis, rather than green hydrogen as it is? Maybe grid will give more availability of capacity to produce more, rather than having just intermittent energies trying to keep up with the production. But then if we try to answer this question, there is another one that comes up, is the electricity price. Is there any excess capacity on the grid, for example, and especially for African countries that don't have? And I think the problem is more, rather than not just a capacity problem, but it also is a grid problem. So if we connect, for example, electrolysis to the grid, so they can feed on the grid to produce hydrogen, doesn't that, will lower, for example, the grid capacity, the available capacity to produce hydrogen? I mean, I think we should answer this maybe first, and then I'll come back later to the continuity of the question. Shouldn't we focus more about grid produced hydrogen rather than green hydrogen as it is, or what are your thoughts?
Um,
Good question.
well, I can comment as well, but I don't want to take all the questions. So
Go ahead, John.
okay. So I think that I briefly mentioned in my presentation, but when you compare the size of the project with the size of the grid, for me, like hydrogen produced from the grid, it's not possible in Africa, in fact. So we see already like load sheddings and so on, and we cannot put in competition, hydrogen production versus the people. In fact, so people, they need electricity. There's not enough electricity for them, and like the grid needs to remain for really the people's need. In Europe, I think it's possible, and now even the regulation in the European Union for the production of green hydrogen, that will allow the green hydrogen to be produced with electricity from the grid, which I think at the end might help for the first years to help for the investment in grid hydrogen production facilities. But I think at the end, on the concept, you could use then coal-fired electricity to produce green hydrogen. For me, it's really a conceptual mistake, in fact. Then it will really depend on the regulation. But for me, for Africa, first of all, the grid is too small to support the production of hydrogen, and then secondly, like there's so much renewable energy then that we could really produce 100% grid hydrogen without the need of the grid. I think that would be more the opposite. That will be potentially the green hydrogen projects that will support the grid more than the opposite side. But then, if you want this green hydrogen project to support the grid, one very important thing is there are two important things. The first is like the regulatory framework. How do you define green hydrogen? Are you able to take it to take electricity from the grid or not? What's the maximum greenhouse gases emission per kilogram of hydrogen? And that needs to be defined for Africa. I know that the AHP or I think the African Energy Commission, they're working on it at the moment. And the second thing is to have a regional or a country roadmap for the integration of these green hydrogen projects in the country industrialization and development of infrastructure plans.
Agreed. I think in this particular area, I think, for example, development of grid, which means just access to electricity, for example, for the electrolyzers, shouldn't be an issue, for example, for countries, for African nations that have 100% access to electricity, but then the available capacity comes in. For example, I looked a lot for the Morocco case, as they have a roadmap, for example, to produce hydrogen for the short and mid and long term. And what I found out is the focus was more about green hydrogen and how should we produce first for the fertilizer industry and the phosphate processing. And then on the mid-term, long-term, look at exports. Maybe Morocco is a little bit strategically well positioned for that. But then when I looked at the electricity consumption nationally, we actually are net importers of electricity. So how can we create an incremental investment to produce hydrogen for large scale that needs a huge capital cost in face of just such a small market? And that's what my question comes up, is that are these large scale projects that are being thought of and trying to develop? Is there a market for them? Is there a market for that particular hydrogen worldwide, for example, or maybe in Europe? So that is the question. Large scale, but how large? And then is there a market for that particular supply?
Maybe I can answer the market question. I think it's one that we haven't discussed much yet, and I think it's important. When we look at exports globally, or just the hydrogen market globally, it's still very nascent, right? And then the fact that a market is nascent brings up many questions. Usually first movers, right? But then also uncertainty around at the pace at which it will grow, what kind of additional infrastructure we'll put in place and at which pace, and also who's going to buy the hydrogen, right? And then you have many linked questions, but I think Marcus alluded to them when he mentioned market barriers. And I think it also links to what Jean-Christophe mentioned earlier with regards to producing hydrogen and linking it to the grid. Not just the size of the grid, but also how can it then ascertain that it's low emissions hydrogen or not, right? So that brings the question of certification. So I think when you talk about the question of trade on a global scale, there's still a lot of uncertainty, right? And when it comes to, I mean, this is mentioned before as well, regulations, obviously having uniform or kind of uniform agreed standards that will allow that trade. And then the certification, I think it's a really important question. Again, these are questions that are largely unanswered today, but I think it's important to have them in mind as we consider those aspects. So those are my two cents.
Jean-Christophe, Marcus, maybe any thoughts about the off-takers and the commitment of off-takers towards green-made hydrogen, African green-made hydrogen?
Nothing more significant to add than what I mentioned earlier. I do think perhaps what I would add, that I touched on it earlier, is the imperative is there to decarbonize. I referenced the EU Green Deal. The truth is that goods and services looking to cater for the European market will be uncompetitive if they're produced using fossil fuel energy. And so I think that that provides a competitive advantage for producers of low emissions goods and services in the way that Rita referred to. I mentioned my colleague Richard. He was in Australia yesterday, where KenGen and the Kenya government are developing a fertilizer plant using hydrogen electrolysis powered by geothermal and solar. They have modelled certain of the aspects of the project on the basis of the competitive advantage that roses exported from Kenya to Europe will have, and the premium price that they will command as a consequence of the value, the inputs into their value chain. So if that's the case in point, one would hope that that green hydrogen can over time command a premium over other sources of fuel. I think we're soon going to be in a position where we price diesel out of the market. We talked earlier about natural gas. Jean-Christophe said the priority is to focus on the domestic markets in Africa. But over time, you can envisage there being stranded assets in natural gas. The beauty there is that the infrastructure can be used for green hydrogen. So the decarbonisation imperative is growing and accelerating, and we hope it will accelerate even further in the next week when people are meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. So what we're trying to do here, what we're trying to look at is how do we how do we address a global crisis of climate, but also we have a development crisis on the continent. We need to reimagine our industrialization. We need to do value-added manufacturing on the continent. We need desperately to create jobs. Now, there aren't many projects or industries that can be as catalytic as this incredible source of fuel, but also an energy vector and all those derivatives of green hydrogen. And Africa, as I referenced, has all these inherent advantages. There are barriers, there are infrastructure constraints, but actually a lot of the barriers relate to policy, regulation, and incentive. And that's in the gift of our policymakers and our regulators. So if we want to be competitive, and given our geographic proximity to Europe, we've got that advantage as well, then the gift is there for us to take. Not for every African country, but certainly for those 6 or so that we focused on in this discussion.
Agreed. I also agree that natural gas will play a role to bridge in, maybe and also blend with hydrogen to, have a more access to electricity. If as Jean-Christophe said, mixing hydrogen with natural gas, and also that gives the right to African nations to develop their own natural resources that have. For example, as Senegal, Mauritania, huge gas reserves that they up for the sake of their economies, industrialization, and also growth. So I think we'll leave it on that note. I think we're a little bit short on time. So thank you all for tuning in. It was really a great discussion. I think we've touched a lot of provocative thoughts, and we're trying to answer as best as possible. Maybe Alassane, a final word.
Just to say thanks to the speakers. This was really informative, I think. So thank for this section. So. And we're gonna try to send the white paper soon. And I just
Fantastic. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for the participants to be here, and hope we can catch up very soon.
Yes. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.